I've worked as a nurse in multiple hospitals and facilities before the current hospital I work at. I worked at a geriatric hospital 30 minutes from my house. I had experience working with older patients before, so this was nothing new to me. I had been working at this hospital for only a couple of weeks, and you'll soon understand why this was on my second to last shift at this hospital. Unbeknownst to me, at the start of that night, I was working the graveyard shifts and I was running on negative hours of sleep. I was assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. The patients in this ward absolutely adored me. My presence as a young girl in her 20s among the residents of this ward who were otherwise left to themselves to float around in their minds, I'm sure saw me as a breath of fresh air, someone who could tie them to the now or to the everyday. If you're just left yourself, you can mentally go to other places, but with someone else in your space, you're tied to that moment in time. I was dealing with a number of patients that night, but one was a little more restless than the others. Her name was Lena. This was my first night dealing with her, and she kept telling me anytime I'd enter her room about the voices she kept hearing, and the man dressed in black she kept seeing in the corner of the room. The other lady in her room requested her curtain be closed before my shift started so that Lena would leave her alone. She was a sweet lady that smiled whenever I was around her, but she didn't say much and was very forgetful since I started my shift around 9 p.m. Most of the patients were asleep by 11, but not Lena. Whenever she called me into the room, she'd be frightened of these alleged voices she was hearing, and the man in black that kept staring at her in the corner of the room. Not gonna lie, it was creeping me out a little. I believe that in her mind she was seeing and hearing these things, and I sympathized with her because I imagined them to be very scary, but still I tried my best to calm her down and get her to go to sleep. I didn't want to turn on the TV to calm her down because I wanted to be courteous of the other patient in the room. I held Lena's hands and told her it's okay to breathe and to relax. I reminded her that she wasn't here alone, and I was always just a call away. This seemed to do the trick. Lena relaxed for a while, and the next time I came in the room, she was asleep once most. If not all the patients are asleep, the night goes much slower time, almost moves in reverse. An hour or two later, I was in the linen room stocking my cart when I heard something in the room. It was a relatively small, dead quiet room. I had the door closed too. That's why hearing another noise was weird. I turned, saw nothing, and resumed stocking my cart. Then I felt what I can only describe to be a hand on my shoulder. I looked at my shoulder, jumped and screamed, but there was nothing on my shoulder. There was no one in the room yet. I knew I felt something large, basically grabbed my shoulder. I went out in the hall for a second to peek my head. No other nurses in sight. Dead quiet. I had nothing else to do but resume what I was doing. I continued stocking the cart until it was full. Then I turned to face the door, and I fell to the floor and started screaming as my heart was immediately in my throat. There was a man dressed in black standing outside the door looking through the glass, smiling. My screams were loud enough to wake the entire ward. The man disappeared out of sight through the glass window of the door. Seconds later, the door opened and one of my fellow nurses came in to help me off the floor as I was hysterical. I asked her if she saw the man dressed in black. Her response was, "What man? There's no one else here." We checked all the rooms in the ward. There wasn't anybody dressed in black in there. My screams woke Lena from whatever light sleep she must have been in, and when I came into her room, she started talking of the voices this time. The screams which she didn't know were my screams. I asked her what this man in black looked like, if he was smiling, and she looked at me, and I noticed her eyebrows point down as her expression changed to look the most focused I'd seen her the entire day. She asked, "How did you know?" And even with my heart still racing, I felt it skip a beat. As she said this, she started screaming, now screaming, "Get me out of here, he's coming." The other nurses came in and tried to calm her down. I was switched to a different ward that night with someone else, and I eventually ended up going home early because I was just so freaked out. I texted the head nurse the next day that my next shift would be my last, that the experience traumatized me, and that I didn't really want to be in that building anymore. I got as friendly of a response as I could have hoped for. I've never been diagnosed with anything, nor have I ever dealt with hallucinations of any kind. I'm aware of the effects of lack of sleep. But this was next level. I don't know if my mind started playing tricks on me from what Lena was telling me all night, but the feeling of the hand on my shoulder, the image of the smiling man behind the glass door matching the description a patient kept giving multiple times. This was one of those once-in-a-lifetime, unexplainable supernatural occurrences, at least. I hope it was once in a lifetime. Three years ago, I contracted bacterial meningitis. I live in South Florida. I don't believe there was an outbreak going on or anything, so I'm not sure how I caught it or who I could have caught it from. I started developing really bad symptoms, painful headaches, confusion, sleepiness, nausea, and lack of appetite. But when the hallucination started, that's when I knew I had something really serious. Laying sick in bed while my husband was at work, I heard a child's voice call Mom from downstairs. We don't have any kids. I dragged myself out of bed to look down the stairway to call my husband's name. Of course, he didn't answer because he was at work. The headache I had from standing was too much, so I went back to bed. For a second time, I heard a voice call from downstairs. It said hello. I picked up the phone and called my husband, freaking out to him into the phone that I was hearing a scary child's voice from inside the house and that I thought I was hallucinating. He heard how distressed I was over the phone, and so he left work early to bring me to the hospital while waiting for him to get home. I changed out of my pajamas, and while doing so, I had to run to the bathroom to throw up. As I was mid-throwing up, I heard another voice from outside of the bathroom. I couldn't hear what it might have said, nor could I tell if it sounded the same as the other voice I heard. I was losing my mind. I wasn't diagnosed until I arrived at the hospital, and apparently, if untreated, what I had could be very serious, even fatal. The doctor told me the hallucinations part was rather unusual, but not unheard of. I was given antibiotics through a needle shortly after I arrived at the hospital with my husband. The doctor told me that I was fortunate to have come to the hospital so quickly, as if I had waited much longer, this could have had lasting effects or possibly have been fatal. My husband stayed with me for a few hours in the room. I was told I was going to have to stay there for a few days to a week, given the severity of my symptoms. Around 10 o'clock, my husband left to go home as he had work the next day. The nurse told me call her if I should have any issues, though I still felt like absolute death. I nodded off pretty quickly. I started having this dream where my ex-husband was in the room over my bed looking down at me. Talking, he was saying horrible things about my current husband. He patted my head and said he was glad I was okay, and that he came as soon as he saw my husband left. He went into this rant about how he despises my current husband and wants to kill him. He kept rubbing my forehead, then left the room. I often have bad dreams about my ex-husband because of how toxic and abusive our marriage was, and why it ended, which I'd rather not include. I woke up in this drowsy, lightheaded state and looked around the room. There was a chair pulled up in front of my hospital bed, but no one was sitting in it. It wasn't like that when my husband left. It was still the middle of the night, so I went back to sleep. I woke up the next morning to the nurse in the room. I told her about the weirdly vivid dream I had, and she left and told me that wasn't a dream, that my cousin came to visit me last night. I told her I don't have any cousins that live in the state. She looked more serious now and said, well, someone who said they're your cousin David visited you late last night. David was the name of my ex-husband. After explaining better, the nurse got a doctor, and the doctor told me the antibiotics may have caused delirium, which hindered my ability to recognize sleep from wakefulness. Hence, why I was so vividly hearing what David was saying. I called my husband to tell him what happened, and of course, she was livid and concerned. He came back again that night after work, but that day I texted David asking what the hell he was thinking visiting me, and how did he know I was in the hospital. My text delivered, but he ignored it. I sent a follow-up telling him I heard all of his threats towards my husband and that I'd be getting police involved. And minutes later, he responded saying, I never made any threats towards your husband. I was simply there when I heard what happened to make sure you were okay. "You must have heard things in your sleep." I responded, "Stay out of my life or I'll get police involved again." He didn't respond after this. I never told my husband about the threats I heard in my drowsy, half-asleep state because I didn't know if they were real or not with a mix of the antibiotics and my already having weird audible hallucinations the day before. I don't think it's impossible that what I heard wasn't actually what was said, but I could be wrong. I left the hospital the next week.